My name is Duncan Smith and I'm the founder of a consultancy called iCompli Limited. Since 2004, we've been helping organisations comply with information law and privacy. Today we're going to be talking about law, and there are a myriad interpretations of the legislation at the moment. Obviously the final arbiter in this is generally legal counsel, so of course we always recommend that you seek legal counsel. But it is important that what you do is you understand as much as you possibly can about the legislation, but then recognising when you get to the end of your knowledge, and when you reach the end of your knowledge, that's the time to reach out to your legal counsel and seek further advice. There's confusion definitely as to whether to use legitimate interest or consent, and I think finally with the Information Commissioner's guidance that's coming out in the UK, we're starting to see a clearer picture of how we're able to make that decision between do I need consent or do I need legitimate interest. When we're talking to people about legitimate interest versus consent, we use a very simple analogy that consent is hard to get but easy to prove, whereas legitimate interest is very easy to get. You take it, but it's very difficult to defend. So legitimate interest requires, in fact, a lot more effort to defend why you have legitimate interest, whereas consent is something that you can generally show once you have a tick in a box or you have some kind of oral confirmation of consent. The regulator's guidance is very clear that there's no hierarchy in these lawful bases for processing. So consent is not better than legitimate interest or vice versa. So there is the opportunity to change between the two, and right now is an opportunity where you could ask yourself, does consent drive any extra business benefits, or would legitimate interest satisfy both the customer and the organisation as well? What we're always asking ourselves is consent mandated in any way? Because if it is, then obviously we have to go out and get a GDPR valid consent from the individual. But if it's not mandated, then we have the opportunity to at least explore whether legitimate interest would work. One of the problems that organisations face is, particularly when they're using consent as the lawful basis for processing, is can I even acquire the information before I have that individual's consent? And what's critical here is that we recognise that there is more than one lawful basis for processing data. So if you want to build a database of individuals, you're processing your data, you're acquiring information, and you may not have had contact with that individual at this point. So what we need to start thinking about is the use of both legitimate interest and consent together to process the data. The legitimate interest is actually a very broad tool, and my legitimate interest in selling you something doesn't necessarily have to align with whether or not you want to be sold to. So in some instances, it can actually override the data subjects. In fact, the regulator's guidance is very clear that if it's unlikely that you're going to get consent for somebody, then you should always be thinking about what is the alternative legitimate interest.